Israel's military has withdrawn its troops from Gaza's al-Shifa hospital, saying its two-week raid was one of the most successful operations in its war against Hamas in Gaza. It says it has killed scores of Hamas fighters, as well as gathering weapons and intelligence in the operation as part of its response to the terror attack on October 7th last year.
This is al-Shifa Hospital, the largest medical facility in Gaza. After a two-week raid by the Israeli army, it is now a shell of its former self, situated in a devastated neighbourhood strewn with rubble.
Destruction is far and wide in the Shifa compound, as you can see, and there have been many casualties. Now we will move the sick and the wounded from al-Shifa to the Baptist Hospital, which is the only one in the Gaza Strip, still providing services for patients.
The operation, described by Israel as one of the most successful of the nearly six-month war, is now over and the troops have withdrawn. The Israel Defense Forces say around 200 militants were killed during the raid and that it seized over $3 million in cash, vital intelligence documents and weapons. Hamas and medical staff deny that Palestinian fighters have any armed presence in hospitals. The Israeli army, though, says the raid was carried out while preventing harm to civilians, patients and medical staff. However, the World Health Organization's Director General disputes this claim. His post on X, formerly Twitter, paints a dire picture. He says 21 patients died during the siege and more than 100 were still lacking vital medical care. And while the troops may now have pulled out of al-Shifa, what they've left behind is a community in shock.
I'd like to welcome Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah, a British Palestinian plastic and reconstructive surgeon who spent more than a month working in Gaza after Israel's invasion. He joins us now from London. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I'd like to start by asking what you are hearing from your colleagues at Shifa Hospital about the state of the facility after Israel's withdrawal.
So today we received the harrowing news that our colleague, Dr. Ahmed Maqadme, a young, brilliant plastic surgeon who I had worked with during this war at Shifa, his body was found executed by the Israelis in the area around Shifa Hospital. He had chosen to remain in northern Gaza and continued to work in the hospitals that stayed in northern Gaza. A young, brilliant surgeon who had won a fellowship from the Royal College of Surgeons. His life was ended by Israeli snipers. And with that news came the news of the end of Shifa. Shifa can no longer be repaired, and that's 30% of the Palestinian health system.
You're describing a terrible loss there. I'm wondering if you could also tell us a little bit about exactly what kind of functionalities remain, if any, at al-Shifa. Are they able to provide any kind of health care at this time?
No function left at Shifa. Not just that. It's irreparable now. It's irreparable in terms of the ability to fix it. It has to be demolished and rebuilt from scratch. And that's the devastating thing. This is 30% of the Palestinian health system. This means that if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, we will be years away from rebuilding a replacement for Shifa Hospital. And that was the aim of this raid, to ensure that Gaza remains an uninhabitable place so that the ethnic cleansing continues well after the ceasefire.
Well, Israel says its military campaign is in self-defense aimed at Hamas and that it does take measures to ensure that it minimizes harm to civilians in Gaza. And after this particular raid, it says it has killed senior Hamas operatives and others who'd regrouped there after a previous raid. They're saying approximately 200 militants in the area of the hospital and that they've detained hundreds of other people. I'd like to ask, based on your experience, how plausible you find their claim here.
So I'll be sure to let Dr. Ahmed Maqadme's young widow and his two little children, both under the age of 5, know that the Israeli army has done its utmost to protect civilian life. but more importantly, as someone who was in Shifa from the very beginning of this military campaign, it is not just that the Israelis are part of this genocidal project. That narrative, the militarization of Shifa narrative, highlights the fact that there is a system of genocide enablers that extends into the Western media that have perpetuated this idea that it was acceptable to attack Shifa under all of these pretexts.
I need to jump in and to provide some context here. Indeed, Israel has been accused of genocide at the International Court of Justice by South Africa. This is a case where we're awaiting a verdict, and it remains a contested term. But I'd love, if you can, for you to paint a picture further of what this means, both for the immediate healthcare needs in Gaza of Palestinians there, but also looking ahead in the years or decades to come in terms of where people might seek medical attention.
Well, 30% of the health system is now in ruin. And so one of the few functioning or partially functioning health facilities that existed in northern Gaza to provide services for the 600,000 Palestinians still in the north has been wiped out. And if there were to be a ceasefire, it will be years before a hospital of this size can be rebuilt and refurbished, making Gaza uninhabitable for the next several years.
Our correspondent Rebecca Ritters has more on the aftermath of Israel's 2-week-long raid at the al-Shifa hospital in Gaza.
The Israeli military have called this a very successful operation. They also called it a precision operation, though that may not be the first word that pops to mind when you see the pictures of the hospital now. The Israeli military saying that at least 200 terrorists, as they call them, were killed during this operation, that 900 people have been arrested and interrogated. Of that 900, 500 have been identified to be partnered with Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and that the others they're still trying to identify. As you rightly point out, they also say they found weapons and intelligence on the site, and that it was very successful, the most successful in the operation so far. They say that they needed to go in because they had evidence, intelligence, that Hamas and Islamic Jihad were using the hospital as a base, that they had regrouped there since the last raid earlier on in the conflict that the Israeli military conducted on the hospital, and that they were using it to regroup and resupply parts of the northern strip. So, yeah, shears have seen sheer devastation. This is a hospital, the biggest health facility in Gaza, and it's been rendered completely unusable.
I'd like to ask you to stay with us because meanwhile, in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under increasing pressure. We've seen tens of thousands of people turn out for mass protests calling for his resignation, and also a long brewing political fight over conscription for Israel's ultra-Orthodox Jewish minority coming to a head. That, of course, in addition to these street protests. Let's take a closer look.
Fed up and furious. Israelis taking part in the biggest anti-government demonstration since the October 7th terrorist attacks, demanding that Benjamin Netanyahu quit and for an immediate deal to get Israeli hostages back.
It's all people in Israel that want he will stop be Prime Minister and move and make some of them want election now.
Netanyahu has pushed back on the grounds of national security.
The calls for elections now during a war right before our victory would paralyse Israel for at least half a year. It would paralyse the negotiation for the release of our hostages. It would end the war before its objectives are completed. And the first one to benefit from this would be Hamas.
Protests not just over the war and hostages. Over the weekend, military veterans tangled with ultra-Orthodox Jewish men over their exemption from army service. Netanyahu's government faces a Monday deadline to come up with a plan to reform conscription, with overwhelming public opinion in favor of forcing the ultra-Orthodox to serve. Netanyahu relies on ultra-Orthodox parties to keep him in power. They've threatened to drop out of his coalition if young ultra-Orthodox men lose their exemption. But if it continues, he will likely lose centrist members. Either way, it spells trouble for the coalition government, the turmoil inside his cabinet reflecting the frustration outside, where protesters say they'll take to the streets again and again.
Let's get back to Rebecca in Jerusalem. Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit more about why these protesters want to see Netanyahu step aside?
Well, Claire, as you heard in that report, they are predominantly angry with how the Prime Minister and the government have handled the hostage negotiation talks since the October 7 terrorist attack and the negotiations that have continuously failed to bring home their loved ones. This protest movement or protest group is made up of many of the same groups that were protesting before the war. Last year, we were covering them a lot last year, these weekly protests against the government, and it's basically a resurgence of the same groups that are now changing in flavour or fervour, if you will, because they're even more angry and more devastated, even traumatised, you could say, about the situation with the hostages. Many of the family members of the remaining hostages and some of the released hostages are joining in these protests. They'll be going for this particular one, be going for 4 days here in Jerusalem outside the Knesset. They're really angry. They blame Netanyahu for many of the things that led up to the October 7 attack and say that he simply hasn't done enough in the aftermath.
Sami Sockol is a journalist in Israel and joins us from Jerusalem. Welcome, Sami. Why are these protesters angry with the Prime Minister?
Yeah, well, this is anger that has been building up now for quite a while. Already before the 7th of October, there was a strong protest movement against Netanyahu. And these people felt that during the time of war, it is better that they would sit at home rather than going out to the streets. But as the months are passing by, and since there is no breakthrough in the war in Gaza, it seems like it's a war with no end. The hostages have not been released, and there is a strong demand that Netanyahu resigns, both for his failure on the 7th of October, both for his failure to release the hostages, and of course because of the corruption cases that are against them. And what has happened most recently is that the families of the hostages, they've decided to join this protest and to demand the resignation of the Prime Minister.
So Mr. Netanyahu, of course, is saying, I won't go. He says that an election now would paralyse the country and help Hamas. Is he the only member of this fragile coalition that's saying that he doesn't need to go at this stage?
Yeah, well, of course, the members of the coalition, they want to stay in power. They're not interested in any elections, since according to all the polls, if there would be early elections, they would find themselves in the opposition. Today, you have 64 members out of the 120 seats in the Israeli parliament that support Netanyahu. And there hasn't been one poll that showed that this coalition would be able to succeed in next elections. So they're all clinging to each other, hoping that the election day will not come.
It seems like quite a strong argument, though, doesn't it? We're in the middle of a war. Now is not the time for any elections. What is the protesters' response to that?
Yeah, well, the protesters, they don't have much faith or trust in Netanyahu. They think that for him, it's just another trick to stay in power. And they will also tell you that Israel already had elections quite recently, municipal elections during the war, when the situation was even worse. When it comes to the front with Gaza. So technically it is possible to have elections. It has been proven. And this is what the majority of the public wants.
And I wanted to come to that because clearly we have these loud, these noisy demonstrations in the streets calling for Netanyahu to go. But is there wider public support for him to go, or are they just a loud minority?
Well, surprisingly enough, the Israeli public, even those who identify themselves with a centrist or even right-wing positions, they're not backing Netanyahu. They think that Netanyahu failed on the 7th of October. They want to see a different leadership. And the majority of the public today in Israel wants early elections. They want to change the politicians. They want to see a change.
So if that change happened, what would happen to Benjamin Netanyahu if he were to lose power?
Yeah, well, Netanyahu would find himself in the opposition because according to all the polls, Benny Gantz, his rival, would be able to form a coalition with other political parties, which would put Netanyahu's party and the ultra-Orthodox parties in the opposition. And this would mean that Israel would have the far right in the opposition. So it doesn't mean that we're going to have peace in the Middle East. One has to remember that most of the public does not support, say, a two-state solution, which is what the international community is expecting to see after this war is over. But still, they do not want to see Netanyahu.
Just sort of zooming out from this, and a final word. How much is cooling diplomatic relations with the United States fueling these protests?
Well, I must say that the impact is not very strong. Israelis are used to having these kinds of conflicts with the Americans. And so far, there has been some rhetoric on the behalf of the administration. There has been some criticism. We've also seen the vote, the abstention in the Security Council. But after all, the Americans are still sending their munitions to Israel. They're still backing Israel militarily. So the Israelis still feel that they have the back of the Americans. This is not really the thing that's pushing people into the streets. In fact, even most of the public support also an operation in Rafah.
Thanks for that, Sami. As ever, Sami Sockol in Jerusalem. Thank you so much.